Strings, Part 3. It's been 2 weeks since the party, and I'm beginning to think that my own time might be getting short. I have had a shadow for the past few days, and it appears that the holder of my string has found me. I blame the newscast for this, but I can't say I wasn't blameless. I let myself get swept up by my own small amount of celebrity. I got sloppy, and it came back to bite me. It appears I've made myself an easy target. A few days after Gabe's party, I got a call from the local news outlet. They wanted to talk about Adriana's murder, and someone from the police department had leaked them my information. I agreed to tell them what I could about it, and they set up a time and a place for the interview. Apparently, the story had really taken off after the interview with Adriana's mother, and people were curious enough about it for them to squeeze ratings from it. I had remained mostly uncommented on by anyone that wasn't at my high school until that point, but that was about to change. My dad let me borrow a suit, since the one I owned was about a size too small. As he helped me into the sleek black suit he used for presentations, I felt pretty sharp. This was easily the best I had felt in my entire life, and I was still riding the high of helping Lisa at the party. My celebrity at school had soared after the word got out that I had stopped her ex from kidnapping her. It seemed that I couldn't walk 2 feet without seeing a red string or an orange string or a hopeful blue string trying to attach itself to me. I likely looked like the aforementioned popular girl with my web of connections zipping off every which way, and I had to stop myself from looking, lest I give myself a headache. I was on top of the world, and I couldn't see how I could ever come down. Though, when I saw the black string that stretched off into nowhere, I remembered that there was at least one person out there with less than friendly interest. The interview went about as well as expected. The spin was very positive. Local boy arrives at crime scene in time to comfort dying girl, and the reporter was more than a little flattering. As usual, I didn't mention the strings. I stuck to the same story I had given the police. I had been walking and saw the man dragging a struggling girl from his van into the warehouse. I had been nervous, thinking about calling emergency services before finding my nerve and plunging into the building to try to help her. I had arrived too late and called for help as I sat with her in her last moments. The news anchor had theatrically wiped a tear away and told me again how brave I was. I just sort of nodded and told her that it was nice of her to say so, but that I was just doing what anyone should do if they see someone in trouble. The interview wrapped up, and as the cameras cut, she thanked me and told me she was sorry for what I had endured. Finding that poor girl like that, I can't imagine how that must haunt you. On that note, she had no idea. A few days later, I saw the van. I believe the first time might have been a coincidence. I was walking home, Mark buzzing in my ear about something, when I saw the van driving in the opposite direction. The windows were tinted, the driver little more than an outline, but I noticed him, and he craned his neck around to look at me. I felt a prickle run up my back. He had nearly broken his neck trying to get a look at me, but I put it out of my mind. So what? Maybe he recognized me from the news broadcast. It was no big deal. As Mark told me bye, it brought me back to reality. He left for his house and left me to walk the 3 blocks to my own. I hadn't been walking long when I heard a soft voice from nowhere. "You have a shadow." I jumped a little and tried not to look around. Adriana hadn't popped in for a chat since that night with Lisa, and her intrusions were a little worrying. I couldn't honestly believe some ghost girl was hanging out in my head, but did that make her a manifestation of my own intuition or something? Some kind of Jiminy Cricket conscience voice that lived in my noggin? What was she, and why did she keep popping up? "That van looks familiar," she said as I tried my best to maintain my pace. "Kind of like the one he pulled me into." I didn't dare look behind me, but I could hear tires driving slowly over the pavement. This wasn't real. I had seen a van and was just psyching myself out. If I turned around right now, I would probably just see a mail truck or a taxi pulling up to someone's house. There was no proof that the vehicle behind me was the same white van at all. But there wasn't any proof it wasn't. "I'd cut down the side road. He's getting closer." I cut down the alley before I could think about it too much. I heard the vehicle roll on as I sped up, making my way between two streets. The alley was too narrow for the van to fit, but I was sure it would double back and come for me on the adjoining street. I could hear the sound of someone accelerating, and I would likely come out of the alley just in time for them to run me over. I had started to panic when I looked down and saw the very thing that would likely send me over the edge. The black string was rotating, following the course of the van. "Duck behind that dumpster and stay absolutely still." Adriana's voice was deathly quiet, almost a pale whisper, and I found myself ducking behind that dumpster before I could stop myself. From my vantage point, I could see it roll past slowly, the driver scouting the alley. I peeked from behind a pair of trash cans, watching it pass with slow deliberateness. I couldn't see much through the tinted windows, but that black string sticking from the doorway told me all I needed to know. It was no coincidence that he was so close to my house, and I would need to take steps to ensure that he never learned where I lived. He had found me, maybe through luck or maybe not, and decided that I needed to be silenced. I stayed hidden there next to that stinking dumpster until I saw him take a left and drive towards Mark's neighborhood. Then I booked it for home as fast as I could. I got home and slammed the door, throwing all the locks before running upstairs. My guardian angel didn't speak up, so I figured I might be in the clear for the time being. I wasn't sure what to do about this, my mind tripping over 1,000 different possibilities. I could tell my parents, but would they believe me? I had no proof that he had done anything, and if the police searched his van and found nothing, it would ruin my credibility. I could tell the police, but that would amount to the same thing as telling my parents. They might also decide that I was looking for attention or trying to divert them from myself and decide that I was the real killer. My afternoons became a steady slog between the window and my door, racking my brain for some way out of this. I would check the window, look down on the street for the van, cross to my desk and pick up my notepad, then walk to the door so I could tell my parents before throwing up my hands and doing it all over again. The one person I could have talked to about this was as silent as the grave, which was fitting since that was where she now resided. He let me stew like this for 4 days before he struck. I hadn't seen the van since that first time, but I felt like he was still around. It's hard to explain, but I would get that feeling of eyes watching me, and I would suddenly change my course and walk another way. I cut through people's yards, went to friends' houses only to leave through their backyard, and took any roundabout way that I could to get home without being seen. That worked for a few days, but on Thursday, it was raining. Mark's dad had picked him up for a doctor's appointment, but my dad was stuck at work. Mom was out getting some things from the market, and I did not want to stay out in the open waiting for her to come get me. I started running, kicking up puddles as I went, and by the halfway point, I was completely soaked. I kept looking around like a fitful deer, sure that the headlights of a van would find me any minute. I would hear the engine roar suddenly, and the last thing I would see would be the headlights and grill as it rolled right over me, silencing me forever. Maybe my mom would find me on the way back from the store. Maybe a passerby would be there to hold my hand, as I had held Adriana's. Either way, I would be too dead to care. The puddles exploded around my feet like landmines, but I barely noticed as they soaked through my sneakers. I was running flat out, my chest heaving and my heart thumping. My adrenaline was high, and I knew that I just had to make it home before he found me. He had discovered the general vicinity of my neighborhood, and the last thing I wanted to do was lead him right to my house. But it was so wet out, and I just couldn't stay in it for long. When I turned onto my street, my porch light in sight, I thought I was home free. When the headlights flooded the other end of the road, the GMC logo standing out on that white panel van, I knew I hadn't. We stood, looking at each other like a pair of duelists. I heard his wheels screech in the deep puddles when I took off running. I was 50 feet from my yard when his tires found purchase. I could feel my sneakers squelching on the pavement, but I put on a burst of speed as his van sped towards me. He was sending water up in buckets, his van plowing down the road like a white bullet. I could see the porch light getting closer and closer, the light glimmering wetly through the pouring rain, but its proximity was no comfort. The van was getting bigger and bigger as it raced towards me, and I was easily 20 feet away as its headlights blazed maliciously. I closed my eyes as my feet sank into the grass of my yard, my foot catching as I stumbled onto the sopping grass. My craggy yard ended up saving my life that day. As I tripped, I rolled across the grass, sliding to a stop on my face. The van drove over the spot I had tripped in a second later, and I heard the screech of tires as he nearly flipped his van on the wet road. He hit the brakes, the car sliding, and barely avoided hitting a tree. As he gained control of his vehicle, he squealed to a stop in the middle of the road, the rain pattering on his van as it steamed. I was dazed, but I kept enough wits to get to my feet and stumble for the door. My keys hung in my pocket, my roar ripping up my throat as I tore my pants getting them out. I could hear his door creaking open, his boots slapping at the turf as he came after me, and I knew that I had seconds to get the door between us. I could see him in my mind's eye, a knife or a piece of wood in his hand, with that sick grin spread across his face, the one he always wore when I remembered that day. The string would be thrumming between us, seeing its moment at hand as I came within inches of death. I shoved the door open and careened inside, slamming it behind me as I threw every lock that I could find. I looked down to find that the string was indeed thrumming, pulsing a midnight tone, as the man beat on the door with his fist. He screamed at me to let him in. He screamed at me to accept my fate. He screamed a lot of things at me as the rain beat down around the house, but I just backed away and reached into my pocket for the phone. I'd call the police, and they'd have him. He couldn't hide now. I had him dead to rights, and they couldn't say I was looking for attention when my hand came back empty. I fumbled in my pockets for nearly a minute before seeing it through the big front window and realizing I had lost it in the tumble. My parents had no house phone. No one I knew had a house phone, and I had no way to connect with anyone without my phone. Unless, I thought, I could get to the computer. If I could get upstairs and message my friends, they could call the cops for me. I looked at the stairs, my legs still aching, and saw the 23 steps as something akin to Everest. My chest hurt, my lungs ached, and my legs were torn up from my tumble across the yard. I didn't feel capable of walking to the couch, let alone up the stairs. Either way, it was the only way I was going to get any help, and I steeled myself for the climb as I took that first step towards the stairs. My adrenaline pushed itself back to the surface as I heard the door to the back porch smash open. It appeared I had less time than I thought. Part 4. I shambled up the stairs on all fours, my legs crying out as fresh adrenaline flooded through me. I could hear him cursing as he tried to wrench the door open, and it sounded like he had broken it worse than I'd thought. The back porch was glassed in, all of it shatter-resistant except for the door. The door was an intricate piece of work that my grandfather had made for my parents' wedding. It sounded as though he had put a crowbar through it and was now having trouble getting the ruins open. It was a bit sad thinking about it being smashed and ruined, my dead grandfather's last great work, but I would mourn its loss later. As I scrambled across the upstairs landing, I heard the door crunch open and the sound of boots on the linoleum in the kitchen. I crawled into my room and closed the door behind me, moving to the computer as I tried to get it to turn on. Shaking the mouse got me nowhere, and I had to stop myself from cursing when I realized it was turned off. I pressed the button, and as it came to life, I strained my ears as I tried to hear my potential killer downstairs. I could hear a voice from below, some stomping about, but it was all muffled by the floor that lay between us. As the computer came on, I pulled up the messenger program on Steam as I typed a hasty message to Daniel and Mark. "I need help. The man from the basement found me. I need help. Someone call the police and send them to my house." I watched hopefully, willing one of them to look at their computer or hear the sound from my message, but nothing happened. No one typed, no one saw, no one responded. After 30 seconds, I was forced to come to terms with the idea that I might be sunk. There was a murderer in my house, a man who had murdered many times, and I didn't want to be the latest in a long line of victims. If he caught me in the confines of my bedroom, I'd be dead for sure, and my room did not have the luxury of roof access from a window. As wet as it was, I'd be more likely to slip off the roof and get killed on the lawn after I broke my legs. No, my best chance of escape was out the front door, and I cursed myself for not running for it when I was downstairs. I looked at the door to the bedroom and gritted my teeth. I needed to escape. I crouched low, peeking out the door as I slunk along the railing, listening for the ensuing footsteps of the man downstairs. He was being noisy about his search, and it sounded like he was destroying my home. He was calling for me, turning over tables and pushing over bookcases, and the longer he took, the madder it seemed to make him. "Come out, you little worm. I know you're here. Why not come out and take your punishment like a man?" I slunk along, glancing down as I made my way quietly towards the stairs. He had his back to me, looking into the den as he knocked things around, and I was taken by the wild and untamed look of him. The last time I had seen him, a baseball cap had covered his head, and the sun had hidden his features. I had built him up in my mind, making him into some kind of boogeyman. Seeing him from the back, I remember being unimpressed now that I could see him properly. He was balding, his red hair sticking wetly to his head, his body slight and bony. He was dressed in the same jumpsuit, the back proclaiming him to be a repairman for some company I had never heard of. The jumpsuit was saturated, sticking to him and showing me a series of long and grotesque bones. He was a bird-thin, balding man, with a crowbar in his hand and a puddle of water growing around his feet. I had begun to get my nerve up, becoming less and less afraid of this walking scarecrow, before he spoke again. "Where are you hiding? Are you in the kitchen? Are you in the coat closet? If I have to find you, I'm going to take out all this frustration on you before I kill you. Maybe I'll break your fingers one at a time. Maybe I'll skin you one piece at a time, starting with your tenderest ones. Maybe I'll give you a taste of what I gave that girl before the end. Keep hiding and find out, you little worm. I have all afternoon to play with you." He had turned as he talked, walking back into the living room, and I felt my flesh crawl as I caught a sight of his face. Have you ever seen someone who you just knew wasn't right? You see them on the subway, in the grocery store, maybe even right next door. They don't even have to say a word. You just know that they aren't right. They have a sweaty look about them, a jittery look. It's a look that tells you their skin barely contains the horror beneath it. This man had that look, and it told me all I needed to know. If he caught me, there would be no escaping unharmed. He moved into the kitchen, and I heard him shoving things around, as he yelled about how he was going to make me watch as he ate my fingers. I moved to the head of the stairs, quiet as a shadow, and started making my way down as he destroyed the other room. I was trying to be quiet, but I knew that my chance was fleeting if I meant to get to the door. Once I got down the stairs, I could bolt for the door and run out into the rain. If it hadn't destroyed my phone, I could call for help and hopefully have the authorities here before he got away. I was nearly halfway down the stairs when I heard the locks opening on the front door. I glanced out the front window and felt my breath hang in my throat. Mom's van was idling in the driveway, and I could see the edge of her grocery bag as she fumbled with the keys. She was opening the door, coming into the last thing she would have expected, and I desperately wanted to call out to her. She was in danger, but I couldn't stop her without giving myself away. She came in while I was dithering on the stairs, calling my name as she closed the door behind herself. "Come help with the groceries," she called. When I didn't call down to her, she started looking around. Her face went from placid good-naturedness to confusion as she took in the mess. She was scared, that much was obvious, and she looked around for the source of the destruction as she called my name again. She didn't think I had done it, but she was suddenly worried that something had happened to me. As she put her back to the entrance to the den, though, she missed the danger looming up behind her. I saw him rising from the shadows in the den like a monster, but my throat tightened as I tried to warn her. The crowbar sounded like someone tapping a keg as it connected with her skull, and she spilled her groceries as she fell bonelessly to the ground. He leapt on her then, her head oozing slightly, as, to my horror, he lapped at the wound like a dog. He was a vicious creature, and as she lay there at his mercy, he looked towards the stairs and caught sight of me. We locked eyes, and I saw him snake his arm around her throat as he watched my reaction. His grin, it was the same grin from my nightmares. It was cartoonish, it was insane, and it was the last thing I wanted directed at me. "There you are," he husked, lifting her face so I could see her. "I don't want to hurt her," he lied, "but I will. You are the one I want, and if you come with me, I promise you that no further harm will come to her." I didn't believe him, but I didn't want him to hurt my mother either. I came down the stairs, telling him that I would go with him as long as he didn't hurt her. I made the mistake of watching as she fell bonelessly back to the floor, and that is why I didn't see it when he swung the crowbar at my head. 1 minute I was watching my mother hit the carpet in the foyer, and the next I was swimming in a sea of black. I would have probably stayed there forever had it not been for the familiar voice calling me back. "You need to wake up." I blinked, but it wasn't really a blink. "Get up, or you'll die." My head felt heavy, muzzy, full of cotton. "This isn't supposed to happen to you. You need to get up. Get up while he's distracted." My eyes flickered, and the dark place was replaced by a shadow place. I could see lights, soft and undefined, followed by occasional harsh intrusions as they scamper across the ceiling. These lights showed me a familiar space, a nightmare space, that I had visited often in my memories. I wasn't against the same wall that Adriana had occupied. I was in between a pair of generators, closer to the stairs and opposite the wall on which I had found her. I could see a similar alcove made by the other generators if I looked across it. I suddenly wondered if all these alcoves had been used to stash his victims. How many others had died in this place? Was I about to be one of them? I struggled, but my hands were tied tight enough to make my wrists burn. I had returned to the warehouse. I was back in the killing bottle. Of the killer, there was no sign. I could hear road traffic above me and feel the sandy concrete beneath me. My legs weren't tied, but my hands had been cruelly restrained. Whatever he had used to bind my hands dug painfully into my wrists. The more I struggled, the more they seemed to chafe, and I had to stop the urge to yell and give myself away. "You need to hurry," said Adriana's voice in my head. "He won't be gone for long." I wiggled around, looking for some way to get my hands loose. If I could get my hands free, maybe I could surprise him, avoid him, maybe even get away and go tell someone. I started rubbing my hands against things, looking for sharp parts, but I was coming up with nothing. The machinery was all smooth metal, the rust flaking off before it could begin to worry at the bindings. The concrete was too flat, and all the glass on the floor was small shards or ground to sand. After a few minutes of struggling around, my fingers felt like they were full of splinters, and my wrists ached from the effort of trying to free myself. I was about to give up when I fumbled across the piece of metal. It made a loud, angry noise when I bumped it, and my fingers went straight to searching for it. It had fallen off of something, and the side of it was rusty and jagged. The end had a cruel point on it, and as I worked the edge against my bindings, I felt whatever it was starting to part. I had to be careful not to cut myself, but as the sound of that half-crazy voice filled the basement, I stopped caring. I needed to get loose before he came back, and as my blood coated the bindings, my arm getting sliced in the endeavor, I felt the work becoming a little easier. "No, I won't tell you where I am, because it doesn't matter." He was coming down the stairs, talking to someone as he descended. I was about 30 feet from the stairs, I judged, as I sliced at the bindings. I knew I wouldn't have time to hide. He would be on me in minutes, and if I didn't have my hands free, I'd be screwed. "So what if I am? That just means that the therapy isn't working. Maybe I'm killing someone right now. That's just one more failure on your conscience." I heard the grating of glass as he came to the bottom of the stairs. I felt the ropes slacken a little as I sawed through them. "Oh? Then why haven't you told the police yet, Is it because you know that you'd be an accessory to murder? Is it because you know that they would ask why you didn't tell them after the first time? Is it because you know that once my mommy gets me out on bail, I'd come to your house and find your children?" He was getting closer now, his footsteps clomping on the concrete. I gritted my teeth, sawing into my arm slightly as I felt the restraints giving ground slowly. "Be still," Adriana warned. I laid my back against the machinery, slitting my eyes as I held my piece of metal. His shadow fell over me, and I could feel those eyes as they slid across my body. They were like spider legs on my face, and I dared not move an inch as he inspected me. He took a step towards me then, and through my slitted vision, I could see a knife in his hand. It was a long one, like a butcher's knife, and the blade was rusty red and thick-looking. This was probably what he had used to kill Adriana, what he had used to kill all the people before me. And if he decided to slide it into me now, I was dead. He brought his face very close to mine, and I could smell his crazed sweat as it slid down his skeletal face. I could also hear the voice on the phone he had pressed up against his ear. Whoever was talking to him on the phone was clearly not telling him what he wanted to hear. I could see his face changing from frenzied glee to barely contained rage, and when he pulled away, his feet made angry sounds across the concrete. He walked to the end of the aisle and started yelling at them, and that seemed to be the moment of my reprieve. As I sawed, though, I saw that string between us, thrumming and pulsating, and realized I didn't have a lot of time left unless I hurried. Don't you dare talk to me like that. You couldn't help me. You couldn't cure me. You couldn't stop me, and now these people are dead. This is your fault. You are responsible for this. Your pills and your sessions and your listening didn't help. So what are you going to do now? The only thing you can do is keep listening, keep helping, and keep watching me kill them as I... When the bindings parted, I almost dropped the piece of metal in my excitement. I was free. I was loose. What could I do? I was still trapped between this man and my freedom. My eyes were on the string, and as I watched, I saw the thrumming pulse that slid between us. The bead of midnight lit the cord with its soupy glow, and I suddenly realized something very important. The direction of the bead had never changed, but I began to understand that it had been telling me my direction the whole time. I gripped the metal as I rose, slowly, quietly, and crept towards him. He was shouting into the phone, screaming at the speaker as he told them 1,000 different torments he would visit on them. Adriana was silent, a voiceless passenger on my road to salvation, and as the man turned, I was already in mid-swing. Maybe he heard me, maybe he didn't, but his face registered utter surprise as the piece of metal slid into the side of his neck. The phone clattered to the ground, and he coughed blood directly into my face. He fell, red arterial blood flowing from between his fingers as I stood over him. The crazy seemed to be spilling out of him too, and he looked at me with a cloudy sort of understanding. His prey had gotten the better of him. His victim had escaped, and now he was the one looking at death. He reached with a shaky hand for the phone, his hairy digits looking like a fat spider, and I stepped on his hand as I bent down to whisper to him. The string was never for you. The string was for me. The string knew what I had to do, even if I didn't. His face registered nothing but confusion, and as he died, the black string began to fray and tumble to pieces. It had served its purpose, and now it was gone. The woman on the other end of the phone was shouting for Harold, shouting again and again, but I hung up on her as I used his phone to call emergency services. It was the second body I needed to report in this place, and I knew there would be questions. The police arrived on the scene in a matter of minutes, and they seemed skeptical about my story almost from the first word. The reporting individual in 2 crimes, both in the same location, was a little hard to explain, but when the officer called in my description, and they asked about the Amber Alert, he started to take me a little more seriously. Turns out Dad had come home a little earlier than expected and found my mother unconscious on the floor and me missing. The signs of a break-in led the police to believe I had been kidnapped by a burglar, and they had taken my mother to the hospital and started canvassing the city for me. It appeared that I had been found, and with the evidence in the killer's van and on his phone, the case was pretty open and shut. Harold Greer was a 50-year-old trust fund baby, living with his mother and siphoning off her wealth. The van, the jumpsuit, they were all simply smokescreens in order to get into people's houses and find new victims. He had been using this warehouse for decades, and it was only recently that the police had started finding bodies. The police estimate that his body count might be in the teens, but they have other remains here that might raise that number into the 30s or 40s. I was given accommodation by the chief of police for valor, both in finding Adriana and in fending off my own killer. They put on a big show for it, and I think the media had given them some flack for thinking I was a suspect. The officers involved did not look pleased, but they ate their crow, and there was no hard feelings from me. People make mistakes, right? "Have you ever considered a career in law enforcement?" the chief asked, shaking my hand and giving me a grandfatherly smile. "You sound like you have the mettle for it." It hadn't crossed my mind before then, but I'm definitely giving it some thought after all this. For now, though, I'm enjoying a nice quiet life as a typical high school student. The strings remain, of course, and I still use them to help my friends navigate the pitfalls of high school. I haven't had a black string since that night, but I'm still young, so I'm sure there will be plenty of time for more murder attempts. When I see them, though, I try to help people as best I can to avoid the fate that's waiting for them. If I can save people with this gift, it makes me feel a little better about not being able to save Adriana. Of her, I haven't heard a word since that night. Whatever she was looking for, it seemed she found it when her killer died. I'm glad the two of us could find our peace.